Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Nadine Heidinger, and I'm the Director of Communications at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, musical and theatrical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or visit us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Today, we're joined by James Shapiro, author of Shakespeare in a Divided America, and NAC member and head of the Shakespeare Guild, John Andrews. Shakespeare in a Divided America can be purchased at a discount from our independent bookseller, Books on Call NYC, and we will be sharing a link in the chat during the program. Following the conversation between James and John will be some Q&A. So please feel free to use the chat and Q&A function for any questions you might have. And without further ado, let me pass the baton over to John, and please enjoy the program.
Thank you, Nadine.
Thanks, Nadine.
Well, Jim, I'm trying to think. I think we have probably done at least 4 programs prior to this one, all of them on site at the National Arts Club. And it's always been a pleasure for me to have you as a guest. And you've always been one of our most popular guests with a wonderful array of books. I think the first one was in 2005 when you had just published 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare. And then in 2010, Contested Will. In 2012, I think it was when you were doing a documentary for the BBC, The King and the Playwright, and you showed that to everyone. And then last, let's see, I think it was in 2015, you were with us to talk about your anthology for the Library of America called Shakespeare in America. So we're delighted to have you back, and I hope everyone rushes out right away and gets a copy of Shakespeare in a Divided America. It's going to be another award-winning volume. I'm sure it's already close to the bestseller list if it's not actually there. So thank you so much for joining us for this conversation, Jim.
John, it's great seeing you again. We've been having these conversations now for probably 30 years, not simply National
You're right.
Club.
Absolutely.
And one of my favorite Shakespeareans, and including in this book, your extraordinary and path-breaking work on Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth, and Shakespeare. So I get to, if not in person, at least by streaming, thank you in this way for the model of your own scholarship. And I always love talking with you when I finish a book. It's one of the things that I look forward to when writing the book.
Thank you, Jim. And you know, as I was reading your chapter on the Lincoln assassination, I kept finding things that somehow I had never looked at before. Here I thought I knew that subject fairly well, but I learned a great deal from your very painstaking research and your beautiful exposition of the material. It's quite a story, isn't it?
It's an extraordinary story, and it's at the center of the book. And when I was writing it, it kept getting more and more interesting and longer. And suddenly it threatened to take over and become the book itself. And I had to go through so many rounds of brutal editing. Ordinarily, when I finish a book, I count the number of words and take 10% of that count and edit out that many words, because today no one really has the time to read a doorstopper. And in this case, I had to do that repeatedly with that chapter because there's so much extraordinary information. One advantage I had that you didn't was in the time between when you researched and wrote about John Wilkes Booth and Abraham Lincoln, there wasn't yet a chronology of the day-to-day life of John Wilkes Booth available. We did have something on Lincoln. So I was able actually to track each of these men over many years on a day-to-day basis, building on the extraordinary research. Booth, as you know, attracts a huge interest, and but independent of the Lincoln interest. So I was able to weave them together and then weave their story with a Shakespeare story as well. So it may look like I spent years and years in the archives on that, but in fact, the great amount of scholarship on those historical figures made that research a bit easier and allowed me to probably make connections that were more difficult for you to have made intuitively when you wrote about this.
All I know is that it was a great experience to read that chapter. I very much enjoyed it.
Thank you.
You know, as you talk about that, I'm reminded, I guess I first became aware of the possibility of a story when we were putting together an exhibition at the Folger called Shakespeare, the Globe, and the World. And we included a section on 6 plays with illustrations of various kinds, archival material, background, influence, and so forth. And one of those plays was Julius Caesar. And what we displayed as our primary object at the Folger was a playbill for a performance of Julius Caesar that took place on November 25th, 1864. And that was one that was organized by Edwin. It was to raise money for the Shakespeare statue that is now on display in Central Park. And Edwin played the role of Brutus. His older brother, Junius Brutus, named after their father, played Cassius, and John Wilkes played Mark Antony. And he may have been cast in the wrong role, but I suspect that he may have already been contemplating the possibility that he might be restaging that play at some point.
One of the things that I learned about that extraordinary production where the 3 Booth brothers got together and performed Julius Caesar was it had been slated to have taken place much earlier that year, not in November, but back in the summer. And in the interim between that initial date for that fundraising for the statue of Shakespeare, they needed to raise $30,000, and there were benefits at BAM and elsewhere in the city. It wasn't just the Booths. The whole New York theater community was getting behind this project. But in the interim, between the summer of 1864 and late autumn 1864, John Wilkes Booth had become radicalized and might have turned out a quite different story had they been able to manage to act in that play at the earlier date. It's very hard to think about that November production without thinking about April 1865, Booth shooting Lincoln, leaping on stage, shouting "Sic semper tyrannis," always with tyrants, racing back of the theater. So I think a lot about that production, and it was an extraordinary moment in the history of Shakespeare in America.
Yes, it was. And I was wondering, as you were in your opening chapter, you talk about the revival of Julius Caesar that took place in the summer of 2017 in Central Park, directed by Oscar Eustis. And you were involved as an advisor in that production. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that experience.
Sure, I'm happy to. It frames the book. The book begins and ends talking about this production. The setup comes in the opening chapter in which I describe the production, and in the last chapter, and I won't spoil it for those who haven't read the book yet. I talk about the consequences of that production for me. One of the consequences was really the writing of this book, because so many of the thoughts that I had about Shakespeare in America crystallized in the experience of this, for many, notorious production.
Mm-hmm.
Immediately after the election of Donald Trump in November 2016, I got a call from Oscar Eustis, who's the artistic director, the boss at the Public Theater in New York. And for listeners who are familiar with the Delacorte Theater, you already know that it has been performing 2 Shakespeare plays every summer since Joe Papp set it up in the early 1960s in the heart of Central Park. And I walked by the Delacorte just an hour ago as I tried to do today. And outside there's a wonderful statue of Romeo and Juliet, a kind of modernist statue. And somebody's climbed up and put protective masks over the face of Romeo and Juliet just as they are about to kiss. And it's very moving.
That's very cute.
Very sad to me that we're not watching Richard II in the park because of the coronavirus, obviously. So Oscar decided, instead of bringing in directors, which he has been doing every year since he took over at the Public a decade or so ago, he was going to direct a play himself, and he was going to direct Julius Caesar. And it's not because he's never done the play. He'd done it 3 times before, mostly on the West Coast, I think. And he decided to do it with Caesar played by a Donald Trump lookalike. The long red tie, the blonde boof, having an actor whose gait and physical bearing resembled Donald Trump's. And the same for Melania. And that was the conceit of the production. And I said, are you gonna bring in Alec Baldwin on this? Because he's done a lot of work at the Delacorte. He said, no. You misunderstand. It's not going to be a parody. I'm interested, he explained, in staging a play that wasn't simply an anti-Trump play. That would have been easy enough to do, and in a way pleasing enough. But he wanted to test a thesis. He wouldn't put it in quite these academic terms. But what he wanted to explore was, what would it mean for largely liberal New York theater audiences to think about removing a demagogue, removing a tyrant by undemocratic means. And the way he was able to explore it was quite brilliant. As the artistic director, he has a very large budget, and he hired 50 young actors in this modern dress production to sit silently in the audience for the first hour or so of the production until the moment when Brutus Cassius and the other conspirators assassinated the Trump-like Caesar on stage. In my role in the Public Theater, I'm their Shakespeare scholar in residence. So I'm there for the first couple of weeks of table work as they're rehearsing. I'm there during much of the early rehearsals just to be a resource. And I work with the directors helping to prepare a text. Oscar didn't need my help. He solicited it. He knows the play cold, and he knew exactly what he wanted to do. And his thinking about the play had changed over time. So what was extraordinary to me was watching what happened at the Delacorte, this outdoor theater with 2,000 people every night, having lined up from dawn, many of them, to see Shakespeare for free. What would happen at the moment when Trump was stabbed, or the Trump-like Caesar, if you will, was stabbed to death? How would audiences respond? And I was there. I have a pass that lets me in, and I sit with the creative team every night, so I didn't have to wait online. And I found this a compelling show. And I came back pretty much every night to see it, which is something I don't often do, because I felt I was learning something about America there, not just about the play or about Shakespeare. And once or twice, when Caesar collapsed, bloodied on stage, you would hear somebody start to clap. And you sat in enough theaters to know when somebody starts clapping, it has a kind of tidal effect where other people join in at the end of a production. That's typically what happens, but often in the middle. No one else on those nights but that single person clapped to see the Trump-like Caesar slaughtered. And what happened at that moment was the 50 or so planted extras or actors started standing up in ones and twos and threes and heckling Brutus and his fellow conspirators for having done what they did, challenging them, screaming at them in a real New York way. And it was a moment of whiplash because it forced us to confront the undemocratic means of removing a tyrannical figure. And until the last week of the run, this was really great drama, but drama contained in the theater or on the stage. But at that point, as I write about in the book, Fox News had picked this up, the alt-right had picked it up, the Pizzagate people who were trying to implicate
Yes.
Hillary Clinton in a child pornography ring were paying $1,000 to anybody who would disrupt this production. And soon those disruptors entered the theater. And they waited until after the professional protesters had already begun protesting and began rushing the stage. And I knew who were the real protesters and who were the faux protesters,
Yes.
but the terrified crowd around me did not. And
Yes.
it became fraught, it became anxious.
Yes.
And it became bigger than simply a production of Shakespeare in the Park. And there were death threats. The FBI came in, lots of security, threats against the director's wife and daughter, threats against the actors. I detail some of this in the book. And it became a moment, you have to remember, as those listening will remember, after Trump became president in January 2017, there were many people who were saying, he's going to steer to the middle. What he said and did was simply to get elected. So nobody really knew by May, when we were doing this, that wouldn't be the case and that the right would settle down. So the consequences for what I describe in the book as a 200-year conversation between those on the left and those on the right over Shakespeare, because all Americans love and claim Shakespeare. That struggle, that contest, took on a new character at this moment, or so I argue.
Did Oscar or you or anyone else have any fears that somebody might actually commit an act of violence? Was that one of the considerations?
Not when it was conceived. And until Fox News made this an issue, there were 6 emails after 3 weeks of the run. Tens of thousands of people had seen it, 6 had complained, which is extraordinarily low number.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people complain all the time. Why isn't this in doublet and hose? You get, you know well those complaints. So until it became a cause for the right, people calling Delta, people calling other sponsors, asking them to cut their funding, which Delta did.
Is that true? Right.
It's true. And it's funny because 2 years earlier, Delta had supported a different production of Julius Caesar that toured New York City, in which an Obama lookalike was assassinated on stage. Nobody complained. Delta didn't say this is wrong. And it showed you we were a new political club. I can tell you myself, and I don't write about this in the book, but I'll admit it here. Some nights I was so fearful about the violence against the actors. Somebody had tried to smuggle in paintballs, and you shoot an actor in the eye and that's the end of the career. I got up one night to leave in the middle of the show because I couldn't take the tension. I couldn't enjoy the production. And I got up and started walking towards the exit. And of course, like you, I'm a middle-aged white guy or 10 older than that. And I looked like a Trump voter. And the security forces thought I was rushing the stage slowly in a lumbering way and rushed to tackle and hog tie me. Luckily, one of the guys from the public security stopped them so that I was allowed to make my way out of the theater and home again. But
Yes.
yeah, I was very scared, and
Yeah.
everybody who was involved who wasn't scared is lying. And there were a lot
Yes.
of courageous actors involved who insisted that the show would go on, that they
Yes.
would not be cowed and not be bullied.
I guess one of my concerns was that given that play's history in our American story, I was concerned that somebody might actually be inspired by the play to go out and reenact it somewhere in Washington or at one of Trump's rallies or something of that sort. And
when I'm asked by British interviewers, what's the difference between Shakespeare in America and Shakespeare in the UK? I say, we have killed people over Shakespeare. You have not. We're a country where people show up at Michigan at the state legislature session with AR-15. So
yeah,
I truly was fearful that somebody was going to be hurt in this.
yes,
It wasn't going to be because of a left-wing protester.
yes, yes. Wow. Well, let me ask you a question, and then we'll open it up to
Sure.
participants in the call here. We know that America is probably as deeply divided now as it could possibly be. Do you see a role for Shakespeare in healing those divisions?
I do. I do because there are not a lot of other writers who we can think of as common ground. Just recently in Alaska, people were fighting over Catch-22 and other canonical books, whether they should be taught to high school students or not. For some reason, Shakespeare has been grandfathered into our system so that 90% of American high schools teach Shakespeare. If I went to a school board and said, I have this great writer, here are the stories he writes about. A Jew takes a knife to a Christian. A black man falls in love with and marries a white woman and then strangles her. You can go right down the list. These are America's nightmares. Immigration, race, gender fluidity, all these issues are there.
Yeah, and that's why he's our American playwright.
He is, but if you came out and said this up front, there would be tremendous resistance. Instead, we speak of this extraordinary, transcendent writer. And he is an extraordinary, transcendent writer precisely because he sees into these issues as powerfully as he does. And there was one insight before we start taking questions that struck me very hard in the writing of this book. And that had to do with Shakespearean comedy. And one of the chapters is about immigration in the early 20th century and the way that Shakespeare was weaponized by those who used large-scale immigration to America and tried to shut that down. And one of the things that I realized by reading plays like The Merchant of Venice or The Tempest or Twelfth Night or As You Like It was, again and again, Shakespeare's comedies, which are delightful and pleasing and moving in so many ways, are also about creating a new community at the end of those comedies that are based on exclusion.
Yes.
Not the Comedy of Errors. The Merchant of Venice ends with Shylock excluded. Jaques is left out of As You Like It. Malvolio is sent packing at the end of Twelfth Night. Caliban is left alone on the island, abandoned when everybody else sails back to Italy at the end of The Tempest. So Shakespeare's comedies offer a model for an America that to this day and to this hour is built on defining who is in by who we keep out.
Right. So the comedies are not going to help that much either then.
They will help if we
Yes.
are, you can't heal unless you can know what.
Unless you recognize,
Right.
yes.
Have a diagnosis first. And once
Sure.
you have the diagnosis, I like perhaps to think of Shakespeare as the vaccine that may cure us of our divisions,
I
although
like it. I like it.
it may take some time.
Yes,
Should I start reading some questions from those that have popped up on my screen, John?
Good.
Let me take one from Greg to both of us. It's about Shakespeare and the plague. How did Shakespeare avoid it, if he did? And did he leave London during its crises? Any lessons for living with our own current plague? From Greg Lipscomb. You may have some thoughts, and then I'll join in.
I'm eager to hear your thoughts. You've written about plague.
I've been thinking a lot about this. I wrote a chapter on plague in my book on 1606. Here's the potted version of that, and then I'll try to open it up a little bit. Shakespeare was born at a moment in an outbreak of plague in 1564, and he was lucky to survive. Up and down his street in Stratford-upon-Avon, many children did not survive. And all you have to do is look at the town records to see, here began the plague and a list of names who died that year in his native Stratford-upon-Avon. The next major outbreak of plague took place in London when Shakespeare was a young man beginning his writing career at the end of what we call the lost years. And that plague broke out in the summer of 1592 and lasted until the beginning of 1594. So for almost 2 years, we have a situation not unlike our own right now. Theaters were dark. And Shakespeare had to choose, as many creative people are choosing right now. Do I hunker down? Do I go hungry? Do I try doing something else? And he wrote 2 extraordinary long poems, Lucrece and Venus and Adonis. And when the plague ended, he went back to writing plays. And in a way that might have been ill-advised because plague could have returned and he would have been out of luck again. The next great outbreak, and that outbreak of plague took the lives of 12,000 Londoners out of a population of 100,000 or so. And the next outbreak in 1603, which kept recurring until 1610, took the lives of even more Londoners. So many of Shakespeare's Jacobean plays were written under the shadow of plague. I don't want to start saying he wrote the tragedies because of the plague and he wrote Romeo because he was in love. I don't think Shakespeare worked in that reductive way. But when King Lear turns to Goneril and calls her a plague sore, a carbuncle, that was a terrible thing that would have resonated far more powerfully for contemporary audiences than it does now. So the answer really to that fine question is Shakespeare understood pandemic. He lived through it. It shapes his plays, and it also caused the closing of the theaters because they didn't know what caused plague back then, but they understood that social distancing was crucial. And the authorities insisted that anytime there were more than 30 plague deaths in a week, the theaters would be shuttered, and so they were. Any further thoughts or questions about plague from you, John?
No, I think you've captured it. I was going to make the point that social distancing was really the only way to address it at that time, that and quarantining. And so we haven't made a lot of progress, have we?
The only way I know we've made progress is nowadays you can't go to an animal shelter and find a puppy because they're all taken home. During the pandemic in Shakespeare's days, dogs were thought to spread plague, so they were all rounded up. Every dog that wasn't kept indoors was rounded up and slaughtered. So maybe in that small way there's been a difference, but not an inconsequential one. Just a PS from Carol to that Julius Caesar production in 2017. Has it been taped? every production has been taped, but because of equity rules, almost no production can be shown. And I don't think in my lifetime or necessarily in yours, Carol, that will change. So I regret not seeing. On the other hand, nothing can compare to seeing a live production, to being in the audience, to be there at a particular moment in time. And I'm not sure this production of Julius Caesar that I described earlier would be as powerful viewing it now as it was in the fraught moment in which it was first staged.
Yes.
Let me take another question. What plays or scenes in particular do I recommend as relevant for healing this divide besides The Merchant of Venice? I probably wouldn't advise The Merchant of Venice. That's a really hard question to answer. And the best answer I could give is all of the plays, by which I mean every play is built on some kind of collision, some contested perspective, whether it's about government, whether it's about the relationship of men and women. And we have to work these things out. We're just not very good at talking about them. So when I think of Shakespeare as something that can heal us, what I'm thinking about is what can Americans talk about? We can no longer talk about whether we should wear a mask in public, whether we should maintain social distance. That has already become politicized. Everything in a way is tainted by politics. Shakespeare too has been weaponized politically, but because nobody is willing to relinquish Shakespeare, there's still a possibility that we can look at Taming of the Shrew and say, how do you feel about Kate's final speech? Or watch Kiss Me, Kate and have that response. Or adaptations of Shakespeare that are not simply the plays themselves, but like West Side Story that was running on Broadway until it had to close. So I don't see a single play that is not open to the possibility of bringing people together. I mean, I speak to or help the public bring theater to prisoners at Rikers Island. I've spoken at Bohemian Grove to largely corporate, wealthy, with a smattering of artists, men, no women allowed in beautiful California, north of San Francisco. I speak to left-wing audiences at the public. Everybody wants to talk about Shakespeare, and I'm happy to engage and I'm happy to create dialogue. And that's really what I meant. It's not a particular play, it's the possibility of dialogue that is so crucial.
And it's the opportunity to learn something about why things go wrong and how they might be repaired if the right attitudes were brought to the problem.
Here's another question. Has there ever been a violent rivalry between two actors in Shakespeare, like the one between Forrest and Macready? Do you foresee that happening today? Let me give a little background on that question before either of us take a stab at it. In 1849, in May, there was a violent riot at Astor Place in what we now think of downtown New York, but at the time it was essentially uptown New York. And Astor Place geographically was, and I'll use my hands here to draw it, the place where the Bowery and Broadway collided. It was the tip of that confrontation. And theaters started making their way up the Bowery and started making their way up Broadway. And the wealthy theater lovers in New York decided they were going to get a jump on other playhouses and build a theater on Astor Place, which is really right where the public theater is today, 425 Lafayette Street. Where that Starbucks on the next corner, where Jared Jared Kushner bought an expensive multi-million-dollar, because it's right on the line between the poor East Village and the wealthy West Village. And it's
Yes.
always been this fraught line. And it was
Yes.
this line there. So the wealthy built the theater, the Astor Place Opera House, and they decided to install rules about who could come in that would keep out riffraff, single women, anybody who wasn't really well-to-do and wanted their own. New Yorkers did not like that. No theater had ever done that before. And they brought in an actor, a British actor, Macready, to play Macbeth. And he played it in a very psychologically complicated way, guilt-ridden way, very powerful production, old school British. It was near the end of his career. And this was at a moment where he had fallen out with the leading Native American Shakespearean, whose name was Forrest. And Forrest was a friend of Andrew Jackson, a kind of Trumpian guy, very physical. He was the first actor, I think, who was found dead with hand weights at the base of his bed. He always lifted weights to pump up and look physically imposing. And Forrest and Macready had fallen out a year or two earlier, and their feud led to this moment where Macready was playing at Astor Place. A crowd of somewhere between 10,000 and 24,000 gathered outside. They tried to destroy the theater. The militia was called out. The crowd didn't back down. The militia fired. 20 people, including bystanders, were killed and injured, killed, 100 or so injured. And the next day, New York could have gotten worse. So that's one of the stories I tell in the book. And the question was, do I imagine that kind of violent controversy today on stage? I've worked with a lot of actors. I've seen some pretty fraught moments. I've seen some quiet violence in rehearsal rooms, chairs thrown a little too fiercely, actors chasing another actor around the room. But I do not think that we are at that moment in the theater community today where one will gun for the other in that way. And if any reason why, it's because it was too costly for both of them. Macready fled to Boston and first ship he could catch back home. He'd wanted to settle in America. That was over. And it didn't help Forrest either that he was pushing protesters to challenge Macready's performance.
Yes. You know, the Astor Place riot itself was really a class war, but what precipitated it when Forrest was touring in London and other British theaters was that he felt that Macready was encouraging the journalists to write negative things about basically an American pretending to be a British actor.
Well, Macready was
right about that.
There was no question his friends were bashing Forrest in the British press. But
exactly.
What precipitated all of it was this terrible moment up in Scotland where they were both performing Shakespeare, where Forrest went to see Macready playing Hamlet. And there's a line in Hamlet, I don't know how you glossed this line in your edition of Hamlet, where Hamlet says, "I must be idle." And there were two, traditions. One was, I must be low key, played cool. And the next was, I must act in a kind of idle and mad way right before a play within a play. Macready liked that interpretation, and he took out a kerchief and swung it back and forth over his shoulder, prancing back and forth across the stage. Forrest thought this was too effeminate and hissed from the audience so loud that Macready stopped acting, sat on a chair when the play was halted. So there are always complicated, personal and gendered and all kinds of issues. And I try to tease out as many as I can. I'm sure I've lost as many as I can.
Yes.
Another question. What do I think of the relevance today of Richard II? That's really another great question and a great play. And I had been working with a wonderful director, Sahim Ali, on a production that would have been open already at the Delacorte of Richard II this summer. And it just pains me that that didn't get to open. And there may be some way or another that will get an airing in the next month or so. And I very much hope in one way or another it does. But
it's an amazing play.
It is.
The language is extraordinary.
But it's hard.
Yes.
Hard play. It's very rarely done in America. The opening scene is so complicated that when I teach it, I struggle because everybody is walking around the steaming pile of Gloucester's murder. And you have to kind of know the backstory.
Yes.
A Sopranos-like moment
that's right.
We kind of get, but unless it's explained in a good production, you
That's
won't.
right. Yeah.
But this play is politically radioactive. I mean, you know that the early quarto editions until Queen Elizabeth was dead did not allow the scene in which Richard takes off his crown and hands it to Bolingbroke to be printed in the early printed versions of that play. So it is a political play. It would have been great to have seen it this summer. Whether it too would have generated protests, a Trump-like Bolingbroke or not, I don't think it was in that way. It's political. Shakespeare is really an interesting political thinker. Not that he tilts it one way or another. You could see the play condemning Richard for being an ineffective and feckless ruler, or you can see the play condemning the rise of a Machiavellian figure like Bolingbroke. The nice things about my role as a Shakespeare scholar in residence is that role would end tomorrow if I told the director, this play is about this or its politics are X. I park all that at the rehearsal room door so that I can learn something from these productions rather than try to impose something I thought of in grad school on a bunch of talent.
You know, in a lot of ways, it's a play about either or. And it's very difficult to decide which of those two sides to come down on. And I think it's all epitomized in the line, there's a moment when Bolingbroke asks Richard if he is finally ready to hand over the crown. And Richard's reply is, I know, no I, for I must nothing be. And when you hear those sounds, you don't know exactly how I is spelled. It can be capital I, it can then be K-N-O-W, and then N-O, and then E-Y-E. I know no I. But
you teachers listening out there, it's a great moment to go to the blackboard and have the students spell out the half dozen ways in which I know no I can be spelled out. And students love that. And then they say, what's the right answer? And what do you say?
Well, it's yes, no, no, yes, for yes must no be. That's another way of doing it.
I know.
So he invented the computer in that line.
Right, the binary,
Yes.
Those are the riches of Shakespeare. Here's a letter from Shauna O'Mara about teaching. And I'll read it. It's a slightly long question. My book provides a new lens through which he, as a public school teacher, could re-examine episodes in American history. I wonder if you think it would be fruitful to use Shakespeare with teenagers, not only to engage them in interpreting historical events, but also to explore how Americans today are divided or how we think about issues like power, freedom, civic responsibility, or the relationship between the state and the individual citizen. I think that's a great question. And I should preface it by saying I went to Midwood High School in Brooklyn growing up and had Shakespeare killed for me there in 9th grade. I hated
Is that right?
And it was deadly. I didn't even get the dirty bits of Romeo that others did. And I swore off Shakespeare at that moment. And in fact, never took a university course on Shakespeare because I was just turned off by bad teachers. And luckily for me, Freddie Laker started flying people to London and back from New York for $100 to $200 every summer. And I started doing that every August after quitting some job at South Street Seaport Market or as a street messenger, and saw several hundred productions in my late teens and early 20s. So that's my Shakespeare education, not a formal one. So I would love for teachers like Sean to go into a classroom and not take a whole play, but take a scene and have students act out just different ways of doing that scene. Take the final scene of Taming of the Shrew and have young men and women discuss, what does it mean for a woman to either subject herself to a man in this way, who has starved her, who has deprived her of sleep, or perhaps ironically speak that final speech of the play. And kids are smart, they're intuitive. If you focus on something that matters to them. A scene in The Tempest where Caliban defends himself against Miranda and Prospero. This island's mine. I mean, kids know exactly what this is mine. And if you can choose the right examples, you can work your way out of the play into American culture and into a global context pretty quickly and easily, and hopefully non-violently. The only time I've seen one of my classes come to blows was back in the 80s in a production of Coriolanus at Columbia graduate class where it got testy, and others intervened before I had to, which is another way of saying this stuff matters.
Right.
If it doesn't matter in a classroom to teenage kids, then you as a teacher have your work cut out to make it matter. And it doesn't always work for me. I'm not saying it does. I've been teaching this teaching these plays and poems for a long time. And I learn a lot from my students. I never taught Twelfth Night until this year. It was a
Really?
that, just to be honest, and I don't know if the people listening really should know this, but every Shakespeare professor you all studied with has an A list of plays, a B list, and a C.
Right.
Here as an editor, you had that as well.
Yeah.
There are plays, the way I describe it is, if I'm drunk and stumble into my apartment, an A-list play, I can make it to my bed without falling over or knocking anything over. B-list play, I'd probably knock over a lamp on my way. A C-list play, I'd make it to the bedroom. I'm just trashed. And
I like it. Very good.
So Twelfth Night was always a C-list play. I didn't get it. I know people love it. I don't fault them for that. And I've worked on productions. I've seen endless productions. It just never spoke to me. And I thought, well, that's my problem, not my students. And I taught Twelfth Night. They got it. I mean, they just understood everything from the bullying of Malvolio to the gender fluidity that's in that play. And they loved it because it spoke to where they lived, not to where I born in the 50s lived, but to where somebody born at the turn of the century, millennials lived. So I've had to change a little bit to accommodate. Let me take another question. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I was wondering, and this is from Ariana Karp, I was wondering if there are certain of Shakespeare's plays that haven't traditionally been popular in America because they are maybe too politically potent to Americans. And she is thinking of Coriolanus and some of the other plays that deal with the complications of a military leader taking on political leadership. Coriolanus, you've edited that play, John.
I have. I love the play. I think it's fascinating.
Why do you think that is one of those plays that, although it has been done in America over time, it has not really caught on?
I think it's primarily because the title character is so unappealing that I think the initial reaction is nobody to root for in this play. And he's a mama's boy, so you don't like his mother either. And but I think it's a very subtle play, and it's one that really rewards close attention.
I love the play. I saw Ian McKellen do it in Thatcher's Britain back in the early 80s. That has always stayed with me. But that is just not a play that seems to matter today. It did matter in the mid-19th century, more to critics than to actors. Forrest had a large statue of himself made up as Coriolanus.
That would fit, yes.
And, you could see yourself in that
Yeah.
way as a Republican hero.
Yeah.
But we did it in the park the year before last, and it's a hard play. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
of work line by line in that dense, late Jacobean style. And
Yes.
there are plays that I think deserve more. Troilus and Cressida it was superb on stage.
Yes.
Cymbeline is a great play. These are not plays that are staged much. And I should also say, when we speak of Shakespeare in America, we're really speaking of a mini canon of the half dozen or so plays
Yes.
that
Yeah. The greatest hits.
you were affiliated with the Folger Shakespeare Library for many years and knew which Folger edition plays were the perennial bestsellers.
Yes. Yeah.
Hamlet, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Lear, and only later than that, Othello, Merchant, and one or two others.
That's true. Yeah, and that probably is still true. Maybe even more true now.
It is. That has not changed.
Yes.
You could say that teachers tend to teach the plays they themselves are comfortable teaching, and the school texts are available, but there's a comfort level that I understand. They're just plays I don't go near in a classroom because I don't feel bad when I leave the room after trying to teach Love's Labor. Maybe others have better luck, so I should introduce the play.
Yes.
Let me take another question. What about plays, and this comes from Catherine Ventura, what about plays that have been adapted and modernized past the point of many folks knowing they're Shakespeare? The upcoming West Side Story by Spielberg, for instance. Do I think Divided America responds differently when they don't know? Do I think that Divided Americans respond differently when they don't know it's Shakespeare? That's another great question. And I would divide it into two categories. One, adaptations like Kiss Me Kate or West Side Story that build upon a Shakespeare plot, but are clearly a different genre than a Shakespeare play. And I would separate that out from modernizations in which the language of Shakespeare is modernized because those responsible for that production don't trust the audience to get the language well enough. And as you know, John, there was an effort reaching fruition now out in Oregon, where they have a wonderful Shakespeare festival. There was an initiative to to bring in 35 or 40 young directors, American directors, to translate Shakespeare into modern English.
Yes.
With the assistance of a bunch of talented dramaturgs. And I wrote against this in the New York Times and made clear that all there is with Shakespeare is the language. And as difficult as that language may be, the first week working in a rehearsal room, if you brought in a scholar like John or myself or the hundreds of other Shakespeare scholars into your rehearsal room, and I'm speaking to directors and producers here, to explain the language and the conventions to the actors, to the directors, you would allow them to grab the handholds that are built into the language of these plays. And by stripping that away and replacing it with modern American idiom, you condemn the actors to be out there with a story that in and of itself is not interesting enough, that loses the music of Shakespeare. And if you think about it, with pretty much every play, Shakespeare took somebody else's story anyway. So why not
Yes,
go to the
that's
original? Why just leave out the middleman if you're not going to use his language?
exactly.
I don't think these experiments are going to work. I do like great musical adaptations, with the full knowledge that West Side Story is not Shakespeare. It's West Side Story. It's the product of a very talented artists who got together in the 50s and tried to tell a story. First, it was called East Side Story. It's going to be about a Jewish girl and a Christian boy who fell in love, and then they realized there was more juice in the story of Latinx gangs and Anglo gangs, and all these. Even a great adaptation will tell you of Shakespeare, will tell you something about your cultural moment. That's one of the reasons why I'm in mourning for the fact that for the first time in hundreds of years, no Shakespeare is being done live at this moment.
Yes.
You can stream great productions, but it ain't the same thing.
No, that's true.
And
True.
That, I feel like I have blinders on.
Yes.
I get up and I read the New York Times and then go online and read the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, Jerusalem Post. I just try to get as big a picture of the world as I can, but that's just to get the facts. Then I have to go to see a Shakespeare production to explain those facts viscerally for me. And that is one of the more punishing aspects of coronavirus. I had to tear up tickets to Comedy of Errors and A Brilliant Pericles and Winter's Tale in Stratford upon Avon, and in the park this summer As You Like It and Richard II. So I feel like I'm driving blind right now, and
that's right.
The rest of you cannot wait for the moment where socially distanced or in the aftermath of a vaccine, we can walk into theaters together and see the ways, and I have to say, back to that early question about plague, if you look at Henslow's diary, which Shakespeare's rival company, the Admiral's Men's records, some of them exist for the early 1590s, and tell us about gate receipts. And we know the gate receipts for the weeks following the plague, where you would imagine people would be wary going into theaters again. But that wasn't the case. Elizabethans rushed back in large numbers in the cold of winter to see plays in 1593-94 because they needed those plays to navigate their world. So I'm hoping, God willing, that we'll come to the end of this soon. And
do you see any uses of adversity in this case? Is there any way we can learn something from what we're going through and emerge better for it?
If we can, it'll be through the plays. So I'll need to see a production to answer that. I see Nadine has joined us again. It is now just about 4 o'clock. Our time is up. John, it is great speaking with you. Great seeing you.
Thank you so much for making time for this. It's a real treat.
Thank
Always.
you. I mean, I've really enjoyed it, and I hope your audience has enjoyed it as well.
Thanks for the good questions.
Yes, very much.
All right.